Hello, welcome to Bergson, the Holographic Theory of Mind. We'll be doing part 19 on mind uploading, a current favorite topic of artificial intelligence, cognitive science. We'll be talking about Wiley's discussions of the subject, Chalmers, CM as opposed to EM, Embodied Mind, or the Classic Metaphysic, and the mesmerism involved with this metaphysic, affecting and afflicting this subject. We'll be talking Cappuccio and his attempt to analyze, attack the mind uploading question from the embodied mind perspective. And as he points out, the return of the scholastics, the scholastic nature of the discussion, angels on a pin, how many, and in all this, the complete disappearance of the concrete, and ultimately the many lost dimensions of problems within the subject. So, mind uploading, or MU. Mind uploading is a concept that we can upload one's entire consciousness to a computer. Memories, all experience, how we perceive, to include our ongoing identity. There are various mind uploading scenarios, for example, copy and transfer, and others, to another device or to a replica of your neural structure. But the essence is the upload to an abstract computer logic structure. Now, mind uploading, I might just start saying MU here, is perhaps the most significant expression of the classic metaphysic that we've been discussing in the previous parts of this series, and its affliction upon our concepts of mind, consciousness, memory, and cognition. It's a sort of in your face, here's our implications completely, that is the implications of AI. Here is what our model implies. This is what we should be able to do. So MU is integrally tied to the notion of the singularity, when robots equal then exceed us in intelligence. Obviously, if you can create mind in a robot or computer architecture, well, then you can upload. If you've achieved the complete simulation and replication of mind in a computer architecture, well, very likely you can upload. Which brings us ultimately then to many strange questions that we'll see. David Chalmers, tied in the NU subject intimately in his 2010 article defending the notion of the singularity, and as he held, its achievement in roughly 100 years, give or take. And also in his 2012 article discussion, which was a response to about 30 plus of his critics. In fact, in that discussion, 20 out of 26, I guess it was 26 critics, agreed with him that we will achieve the singularity in fairly short order. One of those 20 even thought that we were already simulated and we were a simulation. He swept aside the dissenting 6 to include probably the strongest arguments from the embedded side of things that, again, we've already reviewed in previous parts here, part 15, for example. Remember, this is the Chalmers of qualia as a hard problem, as the hard problem, to be explained by any neural or computer architecture. That is, the qualia of the perceived world, the stirring coffee cup, the colors, etc. So, yes, as I've noted before, Chalmers himself does not understand the significance of his own problem. So in the MU discussions, pro and con, you'll see nothing resembling the 12 criteria for a conscious device I laid out in part 11 of this series. You will see almost zero worry that we have no solution to Chalmers' hard problem, thus no theory of the image of the external world thus no theory of perception, and therefore no theory of the origin of experience. Or, therefore, that we can have no clue how experience is stored. In fact, there's truly zero worry about this. Therefore, whether there is any experience to upload in the first place. That merits zero worry. Or on the relation of mind to time. Does time exist? Well, not really, not in this literature. In other words, to hold for MU, you must be blissfully unaware of Bergson and the host of his implications. So let's begin looking at Keith Wiley. He wrote an interesting book called A Taxonomy and Metaphysics of Mind Uploading. It's a very exhaustive book, many scenarios of uploading, put a great deal of thought into it, and he actually considers the metaphysics underlying MU, which I consider cool for starters. Few people examine metaphysics. However, Wiley confines his metaphysical discussion to universals, particulars, types, and tokens. Let's throw in some supervenience in this discussion, perhaps even his thoughts on dualism as part of this. All this is good, and we come quickly to a definition. A brain is a type consisting of a sequence, ostensibly a temporal sequence, of brain state types. Now we've got to halt quickly and talk about what this type token distinction is. It's fairly boring, but an example here is a little sentence. Words and sentences are a good example. Mary goes to Edinburgh next week, and she intends going to Oxford next month. So the same words of the sentence are distinct tokens of a single type. The two words used to in the sentence are simply tokens of the type word to, or next, two tokens of the type, namely the word next. So when we go back to the brain, when he says it's a type consisting of a sequence ostensibly of temporal brain state types, he's really saying that you can't have multiple brain state tokens of a type. That is, every point in your sequence is unique. There's only one word to, or one's brain state that we could call to, or one brain state that we could call next. They're not repeatable. And a brain itself does not exist at a given time, but rather spans time itself, which is nice. So as Wiley readily admits, this is the usual discrete state conception, like frames in a movie, where we have our tree growing, one state, then another state of the growth, then another state, like frames in a movie. He goes on to note that entities that naturally reside in time can be transformed to reside in space by utilizing an additional spatial dimension to encode and represent the time dimension. So you can't invoke the classic metaphysic much more clearly than he has done here. And of course, as I noted in a review of his book, this was the essential piece of metaphysics that he never even discusses. I mean, he is discussing the classic metaphysic and never ever mentions that this view of time as represented in space by a space is in fact a metaphysic. But that's the classic metaphysic. Time is simply another dimension of an abstract space. The abstract space itself is a continuum of points or positions, infinitely divisible, and time simply another dimension of this continuum of points or positions where the points are simply instants. This is the metaphysic underlying uploading. It's the classic metaphysic that Bergson critiqued. Amazingly, there's virtually no awareness of this. There's not one iota of worry about it. We know that Bergson destroyed this metaphysic. Time is not simply another dimension of an abstract space. Rather, time or motion is indivisible or non-differentiable. And there are no discrete instants. When you try to treat motion or time as a series of instants, you hit instantly, so to speak, in infinite regress, as we've discussed, part 3. Or, in Lin's variant of Bergson, there can be no static instant in the first place, because there is always change at the most infinitesimally small intervals. Were there actually a static instant that could be, where the values of that instant could be frozen and fixed determinately, the universe itself would be frozen, never to change again. You could not get a transition from your space taken at a static instant or state of the universe to the next. As my little picture to the right shows, that's each space is a three-dimensional block that represents the entire universe in this case. And so I have an instant of space, then another instant of space, and then another instant of space. But if they're static and therefore are not changing, you won't get the transition from space 1 to space 2 unless the universe is entirely reborn or resurrected each moment. And then you have an interesting problem trying to account for that. What's the continuous process or the miracle behind the generation of each spatial block taken at that instant? Or even for that matter, then from one state of the growing tree to the next. If you can actually fix an instant of that tree growth as a static instant, you're never going to get another tree either, another state of the tree. So what does this mean for MU? Well, the procedure of uploading is rather vague once you leave the computer model itself. That is, the discussions of the uploading sound precise and defined, but in reality they're not so at all, except in a clear case. For example, you can imagine a neural net and copying the network architecture, in other words, understanding the nodes and the interconnections and the connection weights already formed. But this is already a very abstract case. We've already turned what we believe we are copying, namely the brain, into a very high abstraction, and then proceed to copy that. But to take this to the actual physical dynamics of the brain, the chemical flows, atomic and quantum dynamics, cell architecture, the forces of action, muscles for the body action, etc., well, then we start asking, well, just what would a copy of this be? So I personally have no clue just what an actual concrete copy of actual brain architecture, to include all the sloppy dynamics of cells and biology, might mean. Yes, that an instantaneous state is a fiction in the first place. This is a problem for MU copying. That is, these little blocks of space at an instantaneous static state don't actually exist. They're always changing. But the whole discussion, or the actual copy process, as a physical brain body, as I noted, is slippery and illusory. To obtain your near instantaneous state of the brain globally across the entire brain plus body, how would you get it? Because it's always changing. Are you freezing everything down to absolute zero? I don't know. So a better question, I'm just going to move on from the actual copy process. Really the implications of the temporal metaphysic, the actual indivisible flow of time, is what could the MU process possibly be copying in the first place? Or another question might be, what are we copying to? There's two questions. What are we copying and what are we copying to? Are we copying stored experience? But we know that the hard problem has not been solved. That is the origin of the image of the external world. And this is experience. That image of the coffee cup being stirred as we stir it with all the forces involved in all of the swirlings and all the colors. That's the image of the external world and simultaneously our experience. If we haven't solved that problem, then how do we know that it is stored? So Wiley tries to deal with this, that is the hard problem. He evokes the vague notion of emergence, where emergence is sort of like consciousness emerges from the brain processes, somewhat like light from a light bulb. And when we say consciousness, we have to remember that we need to be concrete. That is, our consciousness is our perception of that stirring cup with the hand moving, the forces we're feeling, etc. So that image of the coffee stirring is supposedly emerging from the brain processes, but that's the entire question. We don't know how that image comes out of the brain processes. So it's a concept that even Witkowski, one of the big names in AI discussion in his book Rationality from AI to Zombies, ridicules. So Wiley adds yet another effort. Quote, to be in a brain state of such activity literally is to be conscious, period. Well, that's not much of an explanation, is it, about how we get the image from brain processes. That's only a hopeful plea that this problem somehow goes away. It's bravado and bluff, but it's not impressive. Of course, we know that for Bergson, the image is not within the brain in the first place. The brain serves as a reconstructive wave passing through the external holographic field, and therefore, as a wave, is specific to a source within the field, be it the coffee cup stirring, be it a rock, be it a fly buzzing by. This is experience. The image is precisely where it says it is, within the field. Therefore, it cannot be stored solely within the brain. This image of the external world is intricately related to our metaphysic of time. The image holds stirring spoons, twisting leaves, waving curtains, buzzing flies. And there's no decent theory of the fundamental memory that makes this perception of time-flowing events, time-extended events, the perception of stirring, of leaves twisting gradually down to the ground. There's no theory that makes that possible. There are theories, for example, of the decomposition of the ongoing event into those ever-referenced features. Say again, the edges and vertices of a rotating cube, which are then stored in separate spots in the brain and then reassembled in real time, constantly over and over as the event unfolds. But there's no model of how this could actually be done. It's a high abstraction, or where the handy picture on the puzzle box is that guides the reassembly. If you've broken the entire event up into features and stored them in different spots in the brain, something's got to guide the reassembling of these things over and over and again in real time. I mean, again, I know this before in part 4, these theories are really nothing but air puffs. There's that example of the rotating cubes. Again, we saw that the features, that is edges, vertices, are ephemeral. In the Gibsonian cube, where as the cube rotates, there's flow fields defined over the sides as the sides turn toward us and away from us. The edges become mere junctions or discontinuities at the points of these dynamic flows where they meet. We talked about the strobed cube, the wire cube, strobed at its symmetry period, an integral multiple of its symmetry period. The cube remains a cube, but strobed out of phase, not according to its symmetry period, all those edges and features disappear. That is, those edges, again, vertices don't exist in an instant of time. The strobe is a sample, but nevertheless, things are constantly changing. So how then are these flows stored? How are they even perceived for their time-extended events that require some sort of memory as they're perceived? Again, we discussed all this in parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then there is the actual dynamics and structure of events, with invariance defined only over time. Remember the spoon stirring event with adiabatic invariance for ratios of energies of oscillation to frequency of oscillation, inertial tensors, radial flow fields. Again, how is this time-extended dynamic experience with all of this structure defined over time, forces being stored? Again, there's no theory of memory about this or of perception. There are no connectionist models of stirring. There's no symbolic AI models for any of these dynamic event problems. We could go on. Parts 1 through 7, 9, 11 through 16, all represent massive problems for mind uploading and AI. I find this whole literature ignorant of the problem of perception, blissfully ignorant of the actual problems they face, entirely proceeding in a high abstraction, an abstract space utterly divorced from concrete dynamics, physical realities, and blind to time and the nature of time and the questions that it poses. How is this all ignored? How do we even begin discussion as though uploading this, that is experience, with all this structure over time is even remotely understood? But I digress. So let's forget what we are copying. I give up on that. Let's go to what we are copying to. This is critical, for of course, it is to some digital storage device. That is, again, to what is essentially an abstraction, a symbolic base for an instant or set of instants, which I'll dispute, representing the contents and operation of one's brain. Let's go back to that problem of time. Wiley responded to my review of his book. Quote, "One thing I might say in response is that while the notion of breaking a smooth temporal pattern into discrete, non-temporal slices may seem at first glance logically flawed, it doesn't necessarily have to be, for at least two unrelated reasons. First, calculus shows us that smooth functions can be nevertheless investigated over ever decreasingly short subranges approaching zero length with mathematical justification, and also without necessarily implying that the overall smooth function genuinely consists of individual discrete pieces linked together in a chain, but rather merely that we may conceptualize smooth functions in that manner with the confidence of mathematical rigor." So essentially, we're right back to our discussion of Zeno's paradox, the breaking down of motion into, well, ever decreasingly short subranges approaching zero length, and then claiming that we have a resolution to Zeno's paradox, when in fact we have no physical resolution to the paradox, but rather a mathematical one. Two different things. Perhaps brains and minds can be considered in the same fashion, he goes on, over shorter and shorter time intervals, and with the confidence that doing so truly captures their operation, but not necessarily with the prescription that doing so actually indicates a fundamental discretization of brain function over time. So there's kind of a have your cake and eat it too here, in that we're not saying that brain function is necessarily discrete, but that we can capture it successfully. So Wiley is talking about the possibility of capturing the brain's dynamic processing such flow via discrete sampling. I'm going to short circuit some of the problems with this and simply say it's unclear to me why we need a sequence of states at all. If the brain is a connectionist network, we need only a snapshot of the net, as I was noting before. We need the nodes, the interconnection of the nodes, and the connection weights. The snapshot gets it. If the brain is running computer programs, a snapshot gets all the data and the programs. What more do we need? Why do we need a series of snapshots? Not clear to me. So I'm kind of stopped right off the bat. By the standard theory of brain or net or computer storage, we don't need a sequence to get everything that's stored there. We need just one state. All experience is supposedly stored in the brain in an instantaneous state. The experience of my 2-week canoe trip, the float on the lake, the struggling fish, landing the fish, the burning eggs, the event of the stirring coffee, sitting by the campfire for that matter, the rotating cube. Always good to watch rotating cubes while you're camping. The motion down the lake. All of that would have to be a huge set of storage sites for each time slice, whatever the period of that time slice. Remember, it's infinitesimal, of the canoe's motion stored and the float on the lake. But nevertheless, it's all in one state, one snapshot of the brain, necessarily. After all, if I pull the plug on my computer, then start it up, all the data is still there. It was stored as a static configuration of bits. It was deader than a doornail for a while, and it wasn't recycling from state to state to state. It was all there in one static configuration, and it's memory. Clearly, for the copy operation, for the computer model, we need but one snapshot. The question of experience being captured as a series of states, as Wiley feels, is really whether experience can be described as such in the first place, that is, as a series of states. But more precisely, it's this. Does the brain even dwell in this conceptual world of states? That is, in the world of the classic metaphysic, with its abstract space, and where time is simply another dimension of this abstract space, where points are merely substituted for instants in the time dimensions case? The answer was no. The rotating cube, again, strobed out of phase with its symmetry period, where the strobe is a sample, an instant. Nevertheless, the static features supposedly existing in an instant are gone. This is the fundamental difficulty. The brain does not dwell in the world of the classic metaphysic. The ever-transforming universal field in which the brain is embedded intrinsically, integrally, simply part of that field, is not described by the classic metaphysic. Brain and external field are all dynamically transforming indivisibly in their own metaphysical structure, shall we say. So putting aside this fundamental problem, namely the extreme question as to whether there's any experience there to copy, and putting all the critical thought to sleep, ignoring the clanging dissonance for the myriad of unaddressed issues, concepts, and dimensions, going to sleep, the copy operation clearly is tied to the concept that all experience is there, stored in one state, in one snapshot. And what are we copying the state to? Well, a feature of MU is termed substrate independence, which means, bluntly, that MU folks have no problem copying your mind, that is, the copied state we just talked about, to a computer memory or disk or any convenient substitute that holds that data. Because the substrate doesn't matter, whether it was originally whirling magnetic fields or bubbling water bubbles or cheese and bubbles, it makes no difference. Clearly, the state that was copied is seen as equivalent to a computer state in the first place. And such a copy has an interesting problem. Which brings us to Cappuccio. Now, Cappuccio, who I'll probably call Cappy at some points, comes at MU from the embodied mind position, EM, I'll call it. Actually, he says he's coming from the inactive and extended subvariance of EM. Embodied has subvariance, embedded, inactive, extended. He comes at it from 3 of the 5 E's we discussed in part 15, my 5th E being the whole enchilada of the 4 E's put together. He says, EM can show that the substrate independency postulated by MU is not the standard functionalist version of the multiple realizability principle, but a much more metaphysically demanding interpretation of that principle, one that involves the attribution of autonomous existence and individual identity to purely immaterial entities. A couple things to explain quickly there. The standard functionalist version. Well, functionalism means we just have to capture all the functions of the brain, where one elementary function might be comparing two symbols. And these functions can be realized in multiple substrates. That is, I can use an abacus, again, a register machine of beans and shoe boxes, or a Turing-like machine, read head and infinite tape. In other words, the actual dynamics makes no difference as long as we can represent that abstraction, comparing two symbols. So Cappuccio, in effect, says, you computer guys are far from being pure physicalist. In mind uploading, you are in reality abject dualist, for you are positing, though surreptitiously, non-physical entities. In other words, you are encroaching upon a realm where you do not belong. So, while MU thinks that minds can be transferred and run on anything, like software running on different hardware, as Cappy says, the fundamental principle of all the embodied mind theories is that what a mind is and what it can do strongly depends on the details of its bodily implementation. The body can hardly be critical to the quality and nature of a mind if the mind can simply be removed and put in something else. So EM and MU are incompatible. So he takes a look at this. There's two copy operations that Chalmers discussed. In these operations, we'll be creating from Dave a DigiDave. So there's Dave Chalmers, and we'll be creating DigiDave. The first type of upload is copy operations, gradual upload. And this Chalmers visualized tiny robots running through Dave's synapses. These learn the full schema of their functional organization. They offload the relevant processing to a computer via radio transmitters. The computer gradually imports Dave's brain processes and simultaneously is shutting down these processes in Dave. Dave notices nothing. Each component of the original brain, the organic neurons, is constantly connected to and communicates with its complement in the virtual brain. The last tiny robot shuts down Dave forever. And all we have is DigiDave. The second copy operation is copy and transfer. This uses brain imaging and 3D printing. It records the neural and synaptic dynamics of Dave, and it maps Dave's connectome or neural link structure. This can now be duplicated in another net or simulated via computer. Again, note the abstraction presumed. Dave is still alive, so the activity of Dave's brain is now transferred to DigiDave. The two are connected. The activity in Dave is again gradually shut down as it is transferred. And we say goodbye to Dave. And Dave seems bent on being somewhat suicidal here. So, with respect to copy and transfer, why the transfer of activity? Well, once you have the net structure and its weights, you just start giving it inputs, and it starts responding. For example, in my net down at the right there, if I've captured all those connection weights in those nodes, as soon as I put it in place again, and if I activate the canary node, I'm going to get the responses on the far right side, the black dots: grow, move, fly, and sing. So, not clear why we need this gradual transfer. The activity transfer seems just a cover for simply shooting Dave. It's because Chalmers asked for a form of continuity or connectedness over time. This is important to him. This is why we have this transfer of activity. We need this to assure a mind that Dave's endures over time. So he's uncomfortable with the idea that if I just transfer everything to DigiDave, that is the whole structure, but I don't have the activity going, and that stops. Then I start it up again later, that I've got this break, and somehow therefore I lose identity. I told you none of this stuff makes a whole lot of real clear sense. But in general, note, both methods simply copy to a computer, that is, to an abstract static data structure. Again, we just need a copy of that instant of the brain. Not clear why we need the activity other than the strange sense that I just described. The tiny robots, or brain imaging, etc., this just bows to having to use that type of thing. It's just bowing to practical difficulties in taking this global instantaneous snapshot. All this is a resonant of Chalmers' rather vast misconception. It's what I would call a blind spot, or the dynamics and the criticality thereof. If we go back a bit in Chalmers' writings, we find a thought experiment he described where he gradually substituted a daemon for each neuron in a neural net. Each daemon merely noted the input to his neuron on a sheet of paper. He used the weighting algorithm to determine the output that should go to the next neuron and pass that output figure to the next daemon. Now, ultimately, all the daemons are replaced one by one daemon racing around, writing inputs and outputs on myriads of sheets of paper. So this pure symbolic notation process, argued Chalmers, was perfectly sufficient to, quote, maintaining the causal relations, unquote. Remember that phrase, needed for the net, that is, its computational capacity. In other words, its abstract computations based in this abstract space, not dynamics, that means all to Chalmers. That the net might be part of a humming, vibrating, dynamical system with forces, charge, etc., is not even considered. That is, those causal connections that he maintained are pure abstractions. It's nothing more than notations about inputs and outputs for a net. I mean, it's nothing more than a, yes, something simulatable by computer. That is, actual dynamics, physics, forces, etc., that is required for consciousness, for cognition, that it might be such. This means absolutely nothing to Chalmers. But remember, that simulation of an AC motor, if somehow one can simulate it, runs not one Christmas light, not one Christmas tree light. You need the actual concrete dynamics of the motor to do anything real, anything physical. Chalmers is entirely mesmerized in his abstraction, which is the spawn of the classic metaphysic. As is the entire AI and mind-uploading literature, for which actual dynamics means zero. So Cappuccio is attempting to show that EM has the resources, embodied mind theory has the resources to disprove MU. I mean, embodied versus disembodied, fundamental intuition. We must have a massive incompatibility, as he intuited. But the question, he says, is not simply biological versus functional. That is, biology versus capturing abstract functions that we can represent in abstract spaces. But I note here that embodied mind, if anything, is totally biological. Certainly biological. It's just a matter of how you talk about it. Searle declared that we must have a biological theory of mind. It is the biology of the brain, the biological processes of the brain that Searle insisted creates consciousness. You must have biology, not pure abstract symbol manipulation, as in the computer. He has no clue how biology creates consciousness, nor does EM theory. But biology is clearly the issue here. That is, he has no clue how we create that consciousness. That consciousness is that coffee cup, how we get the image of the external world. There's no clue there. He has a theory, but actually I think in part one I just discussed already why that fails. Now we could have another copy procedure. It creates a physical neuronal replica of the entire body of Dave. And Dave's mind is now uploaded to this replica. If all you need is a body substrate, that is biology, as Cappuccio noted, then even EM theory people would be quite happy, it would seem, with this, because I've got my body, and that's all I need. So the problem is, as he notes, whether a mind can be relocated at all. Can I really move from the same body to another body that's supposedly the same? Well, Cappi argues that there's a critical assumption in MU, and he terms it ultrafunctionalism. Ultrafunctionalism says that the set of formal structures and processes that exhaustively map one's brain activity can be relocated from one substrate to another, remaining just one and the same set. So again, we see the substrate doesn't matter as long as we can carry out our symbolic operations, but in this case, that set of structures and processes or symbolic operations has to remain just one and the same set. This will be important in what follows, for it involves fundamental questions of identity in the first place in this mind transfer. So the question will become, if I'm copying from Dave to DigiDave, do I have DigiDave or do I have Dave? Are there two different people or one person? And again, because of the hypnosis of the classic metaphysic, what we're going to see very quickly is philosophy on the subject, include other subjects. AI and MU are still in the age of the scholastics. So ultrafunctionalism posits criteria of continuity and identity of a mind that are extrinsic to its physical and functional constituents, and unrelated to the specific contextual integration of the mind-body-world system. Well, in other words, actual biology makes no difference. Per EM, embodied mind theory, the causal powers of a mind exist only in relation to its bodily implementation. The very essence of one's mind depends on the contingent circumstances of its material realization. In other words, that physical dynamics is very important, critical to one's identity. A functioning bodily substrate is not only a necessary but also a constitutive condition to have a mind. So these are all Cappi's thoughts, which I'm keeping fairly close to, but this is the language that's used, and I'm simply saying, in other words, that biological, physical dynamics is very important. That's what this is saying. This is critical to your identity, to your consciousness, to your perception. So more simply, a very concrete dynamics intrinsically embedded within the invisibly transforming matter field. Is that the question, or an abstraction? Abstract functions that care less about concrete physical dynamics or concrete time. Concrete dynamics or abstractions that can go in any substrate that serves their purpose. That's the question. So per Cappi, a functioning bodily substrate is not only a necessary but also a constitutive condition to have a mind. Per mind uploading, material contingencies define only the contextual way. Certain tokens implement a type at a given time, but the type itself is a purely autonomous, atemporal, formal structure, which is to say, our little neural net there is in truth an atemporal formal structure that they perceive to be in the brain, and it can be implemented as a token or set of tokens by various devices. The type implemented by various different tokens. necessary versus constitutive conditions. If an entity must fulfill its constitutive conditions in order to exist, and existence is what provides that entity with a unique, that is numerically distinct, individual identity, then embodied mind theory implies that minds are individually identified by the unique material contingencies in which they are realized. But again, we're getting just very close to saying we have a body with a real physical dynamics that has to be accounted for and is all important. But Priem, autopoiesis theory, specifically explains how this flux determines its own identity in contrast with its world environment, shaping its own internal organization according to a self-determining logic that is intrinsic to and constitutive of specific modes of its own spatial, temporal, and causal development. End quote. Now, if we look at autopoiesis theory in Wiki, we see that it's devoted to being an exponent for the body as a system that maintains its identity, maintains its processes as a closed system. But of course, that's describing a flux, a constant change, and again, relative to an external environment which itself is in constant flux and change. So by flux, we're talking about the body-brain embedded within the indivisibly transforming matter field. We are talking about Bergson's indivisible flow and the unity of subject-object within it, and of the experience, perception of time-flowing events with all their forces, invariance laws, and dynamics. That is, if we're standing on the edge of a huge cup, swinging around a huge spoon with all the forces involved, adiabatic invariance, swirling flow fields, inertial tensors, etc., we are in the midst of a flux and an experience. But EM dances or wanders vaguely around the temporal metaphysic. It never actually gets to it. It just never quite gets there, but explicitly breaking the classic metaphysic, bringing physics and psychology to the temporal metaphysic. This is all important. That is, specifically acknowledging the metaphysic in which you're working. We never get there with EM. So when we go back to this Cappi statement that the problem is not simply biological versus functional, again, I kind of ask why? Because EM is above all biological. The biological should really just be shorthand for embodied, embedded, inactive. That is for EM. So why isn't saying we're biological sufficient to defeat functionalism and its raw abstractions? That's kind of what I'm getting at. Same question would be, what is it about biological embedding that makes it constitutive? AI and MU ignore these biological arguments quite nicely, entirely. They're unmoved by embodied mind theory at all. They believe they can throw their formal structures right back into the biological. They can remove them and put them back again. And the biological is just another form of abacus or Turing machine. Why? Why? Because to them, the biological itself is just another formal structure. So the answer is because the biological does not dwell in the classic metaphysic. This is the actual difference. The biological does not dwell in the classic metaphysic. It's not part of the classic metaphysic. It could care less about the classic metaphysic. But Searle does not understand this. Embodied mind folks do not understand this. And hence, this whole argument that they're making is essentially ignored by AI. That's why Chalmers just swept away those 6 naysayers, a few of which were embodied mind folks. The abstract space and abstract time of the classic metaphysic are just as meaningless to the operations of Gibson's resonating brain or Bergson's modulated reconstructive wave brain as it is to the growth processes of a tree. Recall, in our discussion of relativity, the organic growth of a tree cannot be relativized. It's a simultaneous causal flow. It's a growth flow that cannot be reduced to instants. We noted that if we place two lights equidistant from the trunk of the tree, and two branches are growing toward those lights at equal rate, then with sufficient growth of the tree, the lights will be switched on simultaneously, no matter what an observer in motion going by says. For example, we know that the observer on the rocket, as he passed between the two lights, would see the light from the right-hand light first, and then the light from the left would be following after him, so we'd say the two lights are not simultaneous. But unfortunately, that's simply wrong. One can't relativize the growth, organic growth of a tree. Einstein should have consulted the trees. So the brain, like the growing tree or any other biological system, is not actually operating in the 4D point continuum of this classic metaphysic. As a physical device, the brain knows nothing about the abstract continuum. It does not exist to the brain. The brain doesn't care about it, which is precisely why the abstract edges and vertices of that rotating cube do not necessarily exist as far as the brain is concerned. The continuum is simply a conceptual derivative. It is a resultant from cognitive development in the brain. It takes a few years that a conscious being then applies conceptually to external reality and its events. Unfortunately, then, often as though this continuum were indeed real, rather than being a derivative concept. It is applied even by conscious beings to the brain and its operations, turning the whole thing right back around upon the brain. The brain is embedded in an indivisible flow and an extensity that is not the classic metaphysic, not the abstract space and time of the classic metaphysic. Once derived, however, then we turn right back around and apply this to the brain and its operations, as in the computer model, where it's assumed the brain is actually carrying out the operations that support perception and cognition as those simply symbol manipulations within the abstract space and time. But this supposition is wrong. The brain is working in an entirely different, yes, metaphysical structure. Therefore, the brain cannot be modeled, or better, more importantly, cannot be built or reconstructed as a device functioning in the point continuum or abstract space of the classic metaphysic. Thus, when a theorist drives the critical question down to the need to implement the biology of the brain, as Searle did, and as in effect Cappuccio and the Embodied Mind people are actually doing, we are in effect truly entering this question of the actual metaphysic required. And that metaphysic will in turn inform our physics. In other words, we need a new physics based on a new metaphysic. That's what has to be explicitly done. For the biological dwells in the temporal metaphysic. But EM, MU, AI cannot come to grips with this question. And so we come to a sad consequence. For now we discover, as Cappy has nicely pointed out, that we've regressed to the scholastics. Duns Scotus, a Franciscan whom my former Franciscan teachers were quite in love with, and Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican who they hated, debated how bodiless persons, immaterial persons like angels, could have individual identities, for example, Gabriel, Michael, etc., without violating the Aristotelian principle of individuation. In other words, we're talking angels on the head of a pin. Aquinas. He proposed that every type, that is, species of angel, is instantiated by one and only one token. It is individual. In other words, type and token have no real difference here. Why? Because every type of non-material entity, like angels, is a token in itself and of itself. Therefore, if one cites two angels that look exactly the same, then he can be sure they actually are one and the same angel. That is, they have numerical identity. We'll hit this numerical identity in a second. Scotus. He proposed that angels were made of spiritual matter. This allowed their individuation in space while preserving their non-physical status. This also allows numerical multiplicity, that is, multiple identities. Remember in part 10 on quantum mechanics with respect to space and number. Number, Bergson noted, requires a distinct location in space. Each time the spatial location blurs, a permanent numbering becomes impossible. So we have 5 identical sheep. They're indistinguishable except by their position in space. And Bergson had noted that the concept of space, abstract space, and number are intrinsically linked, virtually one and the same. And that the notion of the impenetrability of matter fades when this relationship to number is realized. Thus, de Broglie, commenting on this, quoted Bergson, to admit the penetrability of matter is simply to recognize the solidarity of the notions of number and space. It is to state a property of number rather than of matter. So given impenetrable matter, whether we have identical sheep or identical angels, spatial position allows numerical individuation. Both theoretical options, Cappy notes, are concurrently employed to defend ultra-functionalism or ultra multi-realizability. If we agree with Aquinas that non-spatial formal structures are unique, and that every such structure identifies both a type and its unique token, then given that minds are formal structures of this kind, MU can claim that every time we witness 2 or more instances of functionally identical minds, we can be sure that they are actually one and the same mind. This option is called branching identity. Wiley notes this. It leads to the conclusion that each and every outcome of a mind upload procedure is still the original person or mind, so long as they are qualitatively identical. So we get nothing but Dave. And implies the puzzling consequence that each and every cognitive clone is just one and the same person. Dave after Dave after Dave. If we agree with Scotus, well, minds are made out of formal structures that can be individuated regardless of their contingent physical realizations by reason of their extraordinary metaphysical status. Since despite their immaterial nature, but remember, they have spiritual matter, they have the same topological, that is spatial properties of materially instantiated objects. They're just like sheep at different positions. A sheep at different positions. This clashes with naturalism. It postulates immaterial entities that interact with the material world. And of course, this frustrates all basic requirements of standard scientific discourse. So, immaterial entities that interact with the material world. Again, Bergson resolved this dualism. The embodied mind folks are, again, just unaware of this. The holographic matter field carries elemental attributes of mind. Via its indivisible transformation over time, for each instant penetrates the next, and each instant reflects the whole preceding series of instants. And via the elementary awareness defined holographically by each point reflecting the state of all other points in the field. Elementary awareness at the null scale, the most infinite scale of time, infinitely small scale of time imaginable. That is not the scale of our conscious perception. This allowed Bergson to define the relation of subject and object. It is, we saw this before, questions related to subject and object to the distinction and the union must be put in terms of time rather than of space. That is, no true spatial differentiation between body and the external field. So as I've been noting, we already have a psychophysical field. This, as also noted, does not solve simply the problem of voluntary action. That is how I like to put it concretely, how images affect action in the body. Though, again, EM theory has little awareness that this question even exists. But at least it is a basis, this unity, the psychophysical unity from which we can start. We must understand more about the nature of this psychophysical field. And as we've seen, QM, and particularly special relativity, and a little bit about general relativity, I didn't really go into what I could have done, are inadequate. And we've seen the whole subject of the electromagnetic nature of the field is now ignored. So there's a long way to go in understanding this psychophysical field, and that's what we need. Now there's a third option explored by Chalmers, Cappy notes. And this is that non-extraordinary, non-material structures can have topological spatial properties too. Therefore, they can be individuated and moved in space. Example he gave, institutions like universities can be relocated in different localities. So we might move Oxford to the desert. It's clear that the physical components of a university, buildings, employees, etc., can move from one location to another. It's not clear how the abstract notion of an institution can move in any relevant sense. So per Cappy, all of these three options are metaphysically demanding. They interpret substrate independency in a way that is radical. A mind must be substrate independent, not only in the sense that different material substrates can realize those abstract functions in its functional configuration, but also that its very identity as an individual, that is its existence, has nothing to do with the particular modes of its implementation. Again, particular modes of its implementation, I keep driving back to the concrete. In other words, those actual physical dynamics that describe one's brain and body. So stop. Be concrete. Let's end the high but vague abstractions. The brain/body is a concrete dynamic system, at minimum forming a holographic reconstructive wave with forces, electromagnetic fields, quantum dynamics, charge. It's as concrete as an AC motor in its electromagnetic fields. This whole concrete complexity of this dynamic system would have to be copied. Good luck. Hence why the actual copy operation is, as I said before, vague, slippery, and really utterly undefined. So after all of this, Cappy is still unsure of embodied mind theory's ability to defeat mind uploading. Amazing. He notes a supporter of MU could still argue that there's nothing in ultra-functionalism that violates the principles of biological autonomy and autopoietic enactive definition of identity of a cognitive system. After all, he says, if an autopoietic system can be perfectly emulated by a computer, why can't we gradually transfer its formal structure to a computer, as in copy transfer? Think about that. After all of the talk about autopoietic systems, biological systems, we still don't understand why we're not talking the abstraction, the metaphysical abstraction that enables a computer. So he says, in that case, would the autopoietic enactive theory EM have any a priori reason to reject the full body copy transfer scenario? Now note, again, when we do that little arrow, there's a thing between. There is a digital storage device in between that gets us from Dave to DigiDave. Don't forget that full body copy transfer still has this strange problem floating around too. Do we have Dave, DigiDave, or two Daves, one Dave, two people, two bodies, one Dave? He still has no principled understanding of why mind is not an abstract, purely spatial structure perfectly amenable to AI, that is, amenable to the classic spatial metaphysic. He too is unable to make the conceptual move from the brain as abstract operations implementer to the brain as a very concrete device. I guess that comes down to the whole problem. We just can't get ourselves to be concrete. So the implications of mind uploading are indeed boggling. Unfortunately, this is what I find boggling: the complete lack of concern for the lack of resolution of the hard problem. The complete lack of understanding of the hard problem is the origin of the image of the external world, thus an explanation of our experience itself. The total failure to acknowledge that there is no theory of memory or the storage of experience, or that one is even possible without a resolution to the hard problem in the first place. The massive lack of awareness of the problem of time, the nature of time, or any semblance of a worthwhile debate on the classic metaphysic that supports our current concepts of time. The total failure to grasp the significance of scales of time, seen nowhere in these discussions. The abysmal lack of understanding of Gibson invariance laws, the actual physical dynamics and structure of events. And what if Bergson's brain as a holographic reconstructive wave is fact? Then what for MU? Well, let's suppose it is fact. Then your copy better be able to do the following. Support a reconstructive wave, specifying a subset of or source within the holographic field as an image of this field. Specify this image as a function of the field's relation to the action capabilities of the body, that is, as virtual action. Specify this image as a function of the invariance laws, all the dynamics and laws defining the event within the field, remembering everything involved in that simple event of coffee stirring. Be integrally embedded, your copy, within the indivisible time transformation of the field, such that the field itself serves as a primary memory, allowing specification of time-extended past portions of the field, that is, specification of the past. Past portions of the transformation of this field: buzzing flies, twisting leaves, stirring spoons. support specification of events in the field at various scales of time. Buzzing flies versus heron-like flies, and all coordinate with possible action, that is, the specification of possible action at different scales of time. Via the invariance structure of external events, your copy has to support the reintegration of multiple previous events of the same structure, same invariance structure in 4D memory or being, such that an abstraction, that is a concept, is defined, for example, coffee stirring. It has to be able to support, via the indivisible flow of time in which the brain is embedded, an articulated simultaneity, such that a present event can simultaneously reintegrate and correlate with a past event, the past by present correlation, supporting conscious explicit memory of the past event. Explicit memory being a subject that MU seems to know nothing about. And also recall, it is this ability, the articulated simultaneity, that is required for true analogical thought. And it has to support the dynamic transformations of imagery required for the broadly computational thought of a Penrose or Piaget's concrete operations. This is but a very partial list. So your copy had better be of the entire material and dynamics of the brain. Or if you're replicating that, it must be down to the precise dynamics. So are we starting to see yet the very possible naiveté of mind uploading? So this rather wretched neglect of all these dimensions of the problem undermines any meaning or value within this entire MU discussion, at least as far as I'm concerned. Or for that matter, in the AI singularity discussions, as we've also seen. But if the choice is made to continue to ignore all these dimensions, then I fear this is the continued nature of the discussion that will ensue. Discussion analogous to angels on the head of a pin and essentially worship of the scholastics. So down the road, deep learning is still of interest. The entire subject of temporal consciousness, as philosophy treats it, incomplete absentia of Bergson. More on current memory research would be quite interesting. And the external world as illusion or entirely generated by consciousness, the mind, with no objective reality, quite interesting, or shall we say something else. So next time we'll see. Until then, signing off.